You're tuning in to Missouri NEA Connects, a podcast to focus on all things Missouri education, from policy to practice, so that each of us can unite, inspire, and lead from where we are. We're happy you're here. Okay, we're back on another windy day. We were just talking about that as our theme, our background for every one of these recordings, which, you know what, if nothing else, it's consistent, and I love consistency. So today we are back for episode 4 and pillar 3. That's a little confusing. Episode 4, but pillar 3, which is teacher-student relationships. I'm here with Jenn and Christi again. Can you give us an overview of the pillars again, just as a refresh?
All right. So the pillars of prosocial education are inductive discipline, which is really explaining to students how and why we want them to behave certain ways, so that they can really internalize what they should be doing and how to do that. We are using praise, which is just a social reward to encourage and promote the positive or prosocial behaviors that we're looking for in the classroom, that reinforces those behaviors and draws attention to more positive aspects of the classroom instead of focusing on so many reprimands. Then we also have teacher-student relationships, and we're talking about developing really strong relationships that are based on respect and trust, where students feel comfortable in coming to class, sharing their ideas, having conversations, and not worried about being judged or harshly treated and punished by their teachers. And then our final pillar is the emotionally upbeat classroom. And really, that is creating a positive, warm climate. It builds on the other pillars. Whenever you're doing all of those others, you really do create an emotionally upbeat classroom. But it is, again, a space where students are in a more positive mindset, which opens up the opportunity for more learning and critical thinking and problem solving to happen. And just being really intentional about establishing that learning environment in a way that will promote good quality learning, collaboration, and active participation in class.
And we're going to dive a little bit deeper into the third pillar. Can Christi or Jenn, whichever one wants to take this, same formula. Let's talk about the definition of teacher-student relationship. I'm curious because I always know it as student-teacher relationship. Why is that flipped? But then also a little bit of the research behind that piece.
I see it either way, as student-teacher relationships or teacher-student relationships in the research literature all the time. So when we talk about the effects of teacher-student relationships, we're basing it on research that typically defines teacher-student relationships using a couple of different dimensions. So it'd be how close you feel, how much conflict there is, whether the child is overly dependent or not, are typically the three most common aspects of teacher-student relationship. Obviously, there's more that could be measured as well. And when we measure it, we ask students for questions like, when I'm with my teacher, I feel mad, or I feel good, or I feel happy, or my teacher thinks what I say is important. My teacher cares about how I do in school. My teacher likes to be with me. My teacher has plenty of time for me. With really little children, we might just ask two simple questions. Does your teacher smile at you? Does your teacher like you? Which they can answer with a smiley face or something. So those are the kinds of measures that we use when we're talking about what is the quality of a teacher-student relationship. Obviously, those kinds of relationships can vary tremendously because we all have students that are very easy to connect with and students who may be a little harder for us to connect with. And sometimes not having a positive teacher-student relationship just means I really don't know this student. But it also could mean I find this student very difficult to be with. So it can run that whole gamut. And you can recognize whether you have positive teacher-student relationships in a variety of ways, but one of the most common is that students are leavers of classrooms where they are not, happy or feel like they belong. So there's a lot of absence. There's a lot of leaving the class to go to the bathroom or for whatever. There may be a lot of leaving the class to go have talks with your restorative practices team member, or even just dawdling outside the classroom. So having positive teacher-student relationships is a big deal. It makes a lot of difference for students. So students are better able to regulate their emotions when they are in classrooms where they feel like, their teacher cares about them. So they get less frustrated when they're learning challenging things. They're less tense. Students who have challenging relationships with their teachers tend to actually have worsening emotional regulation across the school year. So that's really, teacher-student relationships are really important for emotion regulation. Also, students are more motivated to work hard in classrooms where they feel like their teachers care about them. And so they end up learning more. And in fact, the effect size for teacher-student relationships is larger than a lot of things that you might think would make a bigger difference, like classroom size, curriculum choices, decisions about how you're going to, what instructional practices you're going to use. The effect of teacher-student relationships is larger than each of those variables. But I think a critical thing that's also important to recognize is that they're really important for teachers. So teachers feel less stress and burnout when they have positive relationships with their students. That's why a lot of people go into teaching, because they want those connections. Teachers also feel greater motivation, greater confidence, greater self-efficacy. And we in Missouri here conducted a study using MNEA data from all the school districts that are involved in the Network for Educator Effectiveness. And we found that when students reported more positive teacher-student relationships, the teachers actually engaged in higher quality teaching practices. And these are the hard to do teaching practices. So things like promoting critical thinking, cognitively engaging students, and doing those quick checks for understanding as a lesson is progressing. We call those advanced teaching practices. They're really hard to do consistently. So they tend to be somewhat rare compared to other teaching practices. And we got more frequent use of those practices when there were better teacher-student relationships. That particular study has been one of our most cited. It's reached the most social media. So it was really an exciting study, exciting results, and conducted right here in Missouri.
I was just thinking what a beautiful partnership between Prosocial and MNEA. Because MNEA, I've taught in 2 different schools with MNEA, and I really liked the program. I felt like it helped me grow when used appropriately by administration, and I loved getting the student surveys. That was the one that was my favorite, because I wanted to see what my students were saying, because that's what's important to me, not some arbitrary. I'm not saying it's arbitrary. Sorry, MNEA. Some number that administrators coming in giving me, but my students are really what I was very excited to hear from. So I really love that you all looked into that data as well. That's a great partnership, and Missouri-based. Love it.
That's one thing I was going to kind of add to that. Christi said that it's the students' perceptions of those relationships. And if we don't know what the students think about the relationship between the teacher and students, a lot of the times the teachers misunderstand or think they have a really good relationship with the students, and then sometimes the kids don't see it that way from their perspective. And so getting some of that survey data, or doing some kind of activity to try and learn more about how the kids see the relationship from their perspective is really important. Well, one example that we had, we worked with this was actually a high school teacher, had we were actually working with the high school administrator. He had a high school student that had come to school late and went to his math class and sat in his math class and just was it was first class of the day, but he was tardy. Because he was tardy, he was given a detention after school. So he was already kind of sitting in this math class stewing over, I'm going to have detention, which means I'm going to have to miss part of football practice. So now I have to run laps at football practice because of this. So he was kind of already stewing on that and didn't happen to notice that he had his feet propped up on the little wire basket under the desk in front of him. And while he did that, there was some mud that had been knocked off of his boots onto the floor. And the math teacher noticed that he had gotten clumps of mud on the floor, and he yelled at the young man and said, "Get down and clean up your mess. I can't believe you would make that kind of a mess in my classroom." And the young man asked for a broom, and he said, "Nope, you can get down and clean that up with your hands." And he was like, no, I'm not doing that. And the teacher then, "You're refusing to clean up a mess that you made. How dare you?" And the young man, who was already not having a great start to his day, kind of got up and yelled back at the teacher. And as he was getting up, he kind of scooted his desk and a little bit too hard, and it bumped into a bookshelf, which then knocked something loose on the bookshelf. So that was damage to school property. And now you have to go to the office and you're in so much trouble, mister. So what started off as not a great day led to a series of events that escalated beyond the teacher's control and led to an office referral. So then the student had a day of in-school suspension on top of after-school detention and laps at football practice and whatnot. So it just really compounded. And when the administrator received the student in the office and was explaining the situation, the young man was like, "I, had cattle out this morning. I had to help my dad get the cattle back in. So I got mud on my boots. And that's why I was late to school, because I had to help my dad before I could get here. And that led off all of these things that happened that he felt out of his control. And then the teacher started yelling at me, and he hates me. And I can't ever do anything in that class to make this teacher happy. And I never want to go back to that classroom ever again." And the administrator had no choice but to send that young man back to that class that was the only math teacher in the building. And when the student ended up going back into class, he, sits back and stews on, "This teacher hates me. I don't want to be here. I hate this class. I just want to get out of here," instead of listening to the teaching and engaging in the learning that's happening in that classroom. And we were meeting with the building principal, and he was like, "How do I help them get over this? Because the kid's not learning anything, and the teacher's still angry that I keep sending this kid back to class." And we talked to him like the teacher is going to have to work to try and repair that relationship. And starting with an apology of, he possibly overreacted to the situation of having mud on the floor and not understanding where the child was coming from whenever he was entering the classroom, and maybe other ways to handle a situation like that. But working really hard to repair that relationship was going to be essential, because now that child is most certainly not learning anything whenever they're stewing and trying to figure out, like Christi mentioned, ways to leave the classroom. That's what's going through his brain. It's not anything about math. It's how do I get out of here, and I don't want to be here. So
Thank you for that. I have heard you say that in a training, and it always is very impactful for all the educators there, because they're like, "I've had that situation." Very something that maybe not mud on the boots, but similar, and it's analogous for a lot of different situations. Now, thinking about, we can use this as a way to go into tips and tricks. So not only proactive, but then also in the realm of repair. What does that look like for teacher-student relationships in a situation similar to that, if you want to keep using that example?
So I think the two things that we've talked about so far in prosocial ed, the praise. So we work on catching kids being good and notice it, and publicly praise them for when they're doing good, kind things for one another. And then the use of induction. So explaining why behavior needs to change as opposed to escalating immediately to some kind of a power assertive power play with the student are really important. We had one teacher who said that just doing those two things alone helped her create a positive relationship. She said, I have a stronger relationships this year with my class than I've had before, and I have had 0 office referrals this year. So, that's really exciting to hear. But I think another very important thing you can do to build relationships is to tell students what you admire in them. Like, who doesn't respond to somebody saying, I've noticed that you're really good at this, or you're really good at that. What are, just think for a minute, like, what are the strengths and skills that your students bring to the learning environment? And especially the ones that you have a bit of a challenge connecting with. What do you see in them? Is it that they're very sensitive to others? Is it that they have a great sense of humor? Is it that they are natural leaders, which is often the case for our disruptive students, right? So, thinking about what are their strengths, and then how can you use those strengths, to build a positive relationship. I think calling home and telling parents what you like or admire in a student is really an important thing to do also.
Yeah. And honestly, apologizing whenever, I mean, we all mess up. We all say things. We've all had experiences like this in the classroom in the past where we've overreacted, and it is completely fair game to apologize. It models that it's okay if you make a mistake and you apologize, and it needs to be a sincere apology, and helping them to explain why you reacted the way you did. It's not going to solve it. It's not going to immediately repair that relationship, but it does take a step in the right direction, especially if it's a heartfelt, sincere apology. I think that is not always something that students get, is an apology from an adult in their life. So whenever we can do that, I think it does help.
I think back to some of I taught 12th grade, and I remember apologizing once for, I don't remember what the content text was, but they're like, what? They didn't understand it. So it's funny, just like even in 12th grade, their last year in the K-12 system, it's still like a shocker to them. So let's normalize that, teachers. Let's do it. And then also the calling home. I wish I would have done that more, because I still remember every phone call I had home to do that, to say, I just wanted to let you know your kid's awesome. They're rocking it. Like, the gratitude from the parent is sometimes you feel like a weight is lifted off their shoulder. You feel it through the phone. Just to hear that, maybe there's not a weight, but it's also just like it lifts them up. I wish I would have done that more. So I'm glad you brought that up. And then these are all wonderful strategies I didn't even think about. What do you admire about students? I should have done that more.
There's also some research that I thought was kind of interesting where they would ask teachers, what do you do to build better relationships with students? And they asked students. And teachers gave the things that you would expect. Some things we'll talk about today, but students added something that was not on the teacher's list, and that is coming to class well prepared. So students receive that as caring, and that was not on teachers' list. So I thought that was really interesting.
I love to hear that. I think one of my greatest compliments from a student ever was, we just really love your PowerPoints and handouts. You really put a lot of time in. I'm like, I do. Thank you. That was like the highest praise. I don't care what my colleagues think about it, but if my kids recognized it, it was, oof, man, that was the best teaching day ever. So that's really cool that it's also in the research, because I can vouch that it works on a very micro level for the educator to hear that from students.
There's also a resource on the Missouri Department of Health and Human Services website about building trusting relationships, which I think is really cool. They use the acronym BRAVING. So each letter stands for something. So B is, have boundaries and be clear about those. Be reliable. So I trust you to do what you say you're going to do. Be accountable. When I make a mistake, I'm willing to own it and apologize, like we just talked about. Vault is for holding things in confidence that should be in confidence. Integrity is choosing to do what's right rather than what's easy. N is for non-judgmental, and G is for generosity. So assuming the best possible motive rather than the worst possible motive of one another. These are all great things for any kind of relationship.
For sure. And I will link that in the description. I'll find that. That's very cool. Well, we've got some tips and tricks. What happens if we've talked about the rate at which each of these pillars takes effect in a classroom? What about in the realm of teacher-student relationships?
It takes a while. This is not a quick and easy. Relationships are things that are built over time. And especially if you've had a circumstance like Jenn described where you violated a relationship, it's going to take work and sustained effort to repair that relationship. When we look at what we consider really close relationships that are almost attachment-like, between a teacher and student, it's about a 9-month process. So that's one of the reasons that people are very enthusiastic about looping, keeping the same kids with teacher for multiple years is because you are already beginning to establish those relationships. In a typical school year, you might be really establishing them, and then the school year's over.
Yeah. I was going to add that some of your students that are more at risk or have behavioral issues will often be some of those students that will push back and resist those relationships the hardest. They're the ones that need it the most, but they definitely take a considerable amount of time. And even with some of those kids, you may not even realize that you're making a dent in forming a relationship with them during that school year that you have them. It may be you're planting seeds and you're working them trying to build that relationship, but you may not see the fruits of your labor immediately. So some of those can be particularly challenging, but they are most certainly the ones that need it the most.
Absolutely. For sure. For sure. I think even with students that do have challenges behaviorally, I would much rather, even if it's a 9-month process, I would have rather looped with them every year for sophomores or for seminar, or have them as freshmen, go to sophomore, like homeroom. I truly think all homerooms should be. I'm a firm believer in that needs to be a looped class for 4 years in the secondary setting. I cannot speak to elementary, but in the logistics of that, but at least for secondary, I think I've always been a proponent for looping as well. I think
it's a little more challenging to establish positive relationships in secondary schools because the kids are rotating. Elementary, if you are in a situation where you've got the kids all day, every day, it's a little bit easier and it goes faster. So yeah, I agree with you. I think looping is important for secondary students,
especially in those homerooms, the ones that stay consistent throughout. If the school has a homeroom or a RTI block, I think that's a missed opportunity if you're not looping those kids with those teachers. So we already talked about how this pillar works with the other pillars. You definitely touched on that, how it works with the praise, in the terms of tips and tricks. All of the pillars definitely lead to this pillar of teacher or support to this pillar of teacher-student relationships. So I just kind of want to get your summation of what is your hashtag for a teacher-student relationship, if you can sum it up into one micro summary.
Can I say that Nell Noddings has this beautiful book called The Challenge to Care in Schools, And one of the arguments she makes is that the first job of schools is not to enhance academic ability, it is to care for students, because morality comes from the memory of having been cared for. So my hashtag would be, I care about you.
Aw.
Oh, that's a good one. I was thinking relationships are key because these relationships are really at the heart of learning. The other pillars are going to help you build these relationships and improve that. But without strong relationships in the classroom, true learning is going to not be as effective.
Oh, absolutely. So true. Typically I can roll one off real quickly, but I feel like all mine are going to be basic. Can you put in like a underdash and hashtag? Why not? In this one we can. Um, when I'm with my teacher, I just think that is so telling. Just if I could, I wish I would have done like a check-in, like a entrance or exit slip on that. Well, thank you for talking to us more about teacher-student relationships. It's going to help me and all listeners be better at building relationships with everyone.